Welcome, gather round the fireside and listen to a tale of Fionn McCool, Cú Cullen, Deirdre of the Sorrows, Gráinne Wail. From giants right down to fairies, of both the drooping and solitary, and those who are sometimes scary. Anything goes by the fireside. Yeah. Fireside, the Puka fireside, the Merrow fireside. Kings and queens fighting heroes, don't you run from the fun, there's no need to hide. Sit by the fireside. Fireside.
Hello and welcome to Fireside, the Irish storytelling podcast. Each episode of Fireside, we take a story from folklore, mythology, retell it, have a chat about the tale itself, and about the craft, culture, and history of storytelling. My name is Kevin C. O'Lahan. I am your host and your Fireside Bard. Welcome to episode 90 of Fireside. Today on the Irish Storytelling Podcast, we are telling the first part of the story of Ireland's warrior king. It is Brian Boru. But before we begin, I want to give a big welcome to any new listeners and to any indeed returning listeners. Thank you for your new or continued support. Please do follow me on Instagram at Fireside Bard. It's the best place to get in touch and the best place to connect with the podcast, and even if you just want to say hello. And I just wanted to say a particular thank you to those who follow me and get in touch with me on Instagram today, because I've actually just been able to qualify for a professional Instagram account thanks to your very kind support, which just means I can spread word about the podcast that bit better. I can sell tickets to the live shows now in future, so that's actually a huge help that I was trying to build towards. So thank you so much for that, and please do continue to like the Instagram. If you're not on Instagram, you want to get in touch, do so by email at thefiresidebard@gmail.com. And if you really want to support the podcast, you can do so over at patreon.com/Fireside Podcast, where you can join our ever-growing community of very kind benefactors. And I actually want to give a very special thank you. We have 3 new patrons this week. This is absolutely incredible. This is the most amount of new patrons in 1 week so far in the history of the podcast. So thank you so much to, I hope I can get, as always, I can know if I pronounce the names correctly, to Jeff Angevine, Matthew Hill, and Andrew Hallinan. Thank you so much for becoming this week and this month's newest patrons. I can't thank you enough, particularly at these incredibly challenging times. Things are getting a bit more lax and we're all trying to get back, slowly but surely, back to normal every day during the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're really not out of the woods here, certainly not us in the arts as well. It's looking like it's going to be next year at the earliest before we're getting anything seriously back going in terms of live performance. But that is the best thing about this podcast, is I've been able to do it from my home setup at home, and now I'm back in the Head Stuff studios, which is fantastic. This podcast has got me through this pandemic, and I've loved getting all of your messages from you saying how it maybe made the pandemic a little bit easier for you as well. So that makes it all worthwhile. And thank you again to the patrons. And the Patreon, again, is, as I always say, is only there as an egalitarian model of soundness. It is only there if you are in a position to, and if you want to support the podcast. If you don't have the means, or if you just don't want to, that is totally okay. But if you don't, if you can't support the Patreon, why don't you just tell a friend about Fireside, and let's keep the community growing. And with that, on to this week's story. This week's story is, well, I mean, what else can you say? You know, from the title, we are talking about Brian Boru. When I started this podcast, 90 episodes, I never did I think we'd be getting as far as Brian Boru, and it's fantastic too. He is another one of these mythic historical figures. He was very much a real man, but he has been so mythologized over the course of the last 1,000 years, it can be quite hard to sift what is fact from fiction. But that's where I come in because, as I say, I'm not a historian, I am a storyteller. So I can benefit from being unburdened by historical truth. As I say, I will never say anything that I know is untrue and will always try and tell the truest version of events, but particularly this area of history. A lot of this is hearsay. We don't know, and there's things that historians will have to say, this probably didn't happen. And I can clear up that, I'll always clear up what is legend and what is rumor, but myth really works in. There's a lot of a current of the Tuatha Dé Danann and indeed of all of the cycles of Irish mythology in the story of Brian Boru, and I have the benefit of being able to lean into that and explore that, because that's the side I'm interested in, is this period of Irish history where Ireland had very much been Christianized, but they still very much held on to these pagan beliefs, and it's where those two faiths came into where those two faiths clashed, and indeed where those faiths then clashed with the Norse and with their beliefs and with the Norse Christians and with the Norse pagans. So you have all of these, you have paganism versus Christianity, clashing swords and heads left, right and centre, and indeed centre of that is this man Brian Boru, and it was so brilliant getting to explore Brian, and we'll be with him for the next couple of weeks. You'll be very glad to hear. So we're going to start with the first part, and we'll chat a bit more afterwards. But here we are, episode 90. This is Brian Boru, Ireland's warrior king, on Fireside. Brian Boru, Ireland's warrior king. They carried off their jewels and their best property, and their saddles beautiful and foreign, their gold and their silver, their beautifully woven cloth of all colours, and their satins and silken cloth. They carried away their soft, bright, matchless girls, their beautiful silk-clad women, and their active, large and well-formed boys. The fort and the good town they reduced to a cloud of smoke and to red fire afterwards. The wars of the Gael with the Gaul. In the latter years of the 10th century, the island of Éire was chaos. The Norse Vikings had invaded, settled and integrated. They had built great towns and cities like Dublin, Waterford, Wexford and Limerick. But they never conquered the entire island. For that matter, no Irish king had ever conquered all of Ireland either. Not yet. The population of the entire island was about 500,000, less than half of the population of the capital of Dublin today. Yet, despite the meagre population, there were over 150 kings. The kingdoms of these kings varied greatly in size and influence, and yes, since the landing of the Tuatha Dé Danann, there had indeed been the title of High King of Ireland, but this was a largely symbolic title. That would all change by the new millennium, with the rise of a new Irish king who, without exaggeration or hyperbole, would change the course of Irish history forever. The most powerful family in Ireland was the O'Neill, who traced their lineage to Niall of the Nine Hostages. But the O'Neill were only dominant in the northern half of the island, in the provinces of Meath, Leinster, and most of all, Ulster. In the southwestern province of Munster, the dominant power was the Eonacht, who held the position of King of Munster. They held this power from the Rock of Cashel in Ireland's premier county of Tipperary. But the Viking invaders had built a city at the estuary of the Shannon River, the largest and most useful of rivers in Ireland. Controlling the Shannon, the Norsemen could sail their fierce Viking longboats inland, controlling not just the coastlines of Ireland, but the heart too. This was the city of Limerick. So the hierarchy of Ireland was complicated, and the order of kings even more so. But one thing was clear. It was the families who could trace their lineage back to the Tuatha De Danann, who had settled Ireland, and the Gaels who had supplanted them. In the west coast kingdom of Thomond, which covered the lands we would now call Limerick and Clare, there was a minor kingdom called Dál Cash. The Dál Cashians were said to be descended from the Firbolg, whom the Tuatha De Danann had fought back west of the River Shannon. The king of the Dál Cash was Kennetig mac Lorcan. His family had ruled the Dál Cash since their foundations. They were said to have been descendants of Anya of the Tuatha De Danann, whom the feast of Midsummer was celebrated for. Anya was known as the Queen of the Sidhe. She was married to Ailill, King of Munster, not to be confused with Ailill, who was married to Queen Maeve of Connacht. Ailill was said to have raped Anya, and in revenge, the fairy woman bit off the king's ear. It was the law of the Tuatha De Danann that no one who was not physically perfect could rule. Ailill's maiming led to his removal from power. He was thereafter known as Ailill Autumn, Ailill the One-Eared. This cemented Anya's legend as a queen who could give power and who could just as easily take it away. The Dál Cash claimed their descendancy to Anya, but they also wore on their banner the metal arm and sword of Nuada Lóv Arigid, the first king of the Tuatha De Danann, who was removed from power when his arm was cut off, until Dian Caicht, the healer, made him a metal replacement, leading Nuada to reclaim the high kingship of Éire. But the Dál Cash were not the only ones who claimed descendancy from the Tuatha De Danann. So too did the Owenacht, who ruled Munster, who had a much stronger claim and whom the Dál Cash had to pay tribute to. Kennetig mac Lorcan was married to the daughter of the king of the west of Connacht, Beiveen. Together they had 11 sons and 1 daughter. Their youngest boy was named Brian. With 10 brothers ahead of him, the likelihood of Brian becoming king of the Dál Cash seemed astronomically unlikely. But this would not stop Brian. When Brian was very young, he and his eldest brother Mathgammon were herding cattle on the mountainside overlooking the townland of Kincora. From this mountain they began to hear screams and cries and smell the lingering stench of smoke. The Vikings were raiding the Dál Cash. By the time Brian and Mathgammon made it back home, the town had been burned to the ground. Many of the people of the Dál Cash were carried off as slaves, but others, including several of Brian's older brothers and his own mother Beiveen, were viciously slaughtered. This tragic event would stay with Brian for the rest of his life. The Limerick Norse were now and forevermore his enemy. But one of Brian's greatest skills as a military tactician was that he learned from his enemies. The Vikings' domain was the sea, and the River Shannon allowed them to rule by land too. So King Kennetig and his sons began a series of counter-raids all along the Shannon. With each successful loot and raid, the power and influence of the Dál Cash grew, and the power and influence of the Norsemen was undermined. When King Kennetig died, the kingship of the Dál Cash passed to his eldest son, Mathgammon. Mathgammon was not content with just being king of the Dál Cash, not even king of Thomond. Mathgammon wanted to be king of Munster. The Owenacht had held the ancestral position of king of Munster because of their strong lineage, but over the years, through battles with the Norse and the southern Uníl, the strength of the Owenacht had waned. All that was left was their name, and Mathgamon believed that the Dál Cash had as much of a right, and now had the wealth and power. With the Onacht impotent, the militarised Dál Cash, led by Mathgamon, took Cashel and the seat of King of Munster. Despite this decisive victory, Mathgamon was never officially declared King of Munster. His claim was still viewed by many to be illegitimate, and his chief political rival was Mael Muad Mac Brian, the ousted King of Munster and the heir to the Onacht. Because Mathgamon was trying to secure the seat of Munster, he had made peace with the Munster Vikings and their king, Ivar of Limerick. This did not at all sit well with Brian, who still sought revenge for his brother's and mother's murder. Once Cashel had been won, Brian and a small loyal band of 200 followers abandoned Mathgamon and engaged Limerick in a guerrilla war campaign. They raided and pillaged surrounding forts and villages, surviving day to day on whatever booty they could scrounge. But with each raid and plunder, Brian lost more and more men, until just 15 out of his original 200 survived. However, word of Brian's courage had reached his older brother, and Mathgamon and the entire force of Dál Cashians came to Brian's aid. Mathgamon convinced his rival, Mael Muad, to briefly bury the hatchet. As long as Ivar of Limerick was in power, he was a threat to the kingship of Munster. The united forces of Dál Cash and Onacht led a siege on the city of Limerick to attempt to drive the Norse out of Munster once and for all. The battle was known as the Battle of Sulcott, fought outside the city of Limerick. The fight was long and bloody, with swords and blood drawn from sun's rise to fall each day. The united front of Dál Cash and Onacht drove Ivar's Norsemen back into Limerick, cutting heads off as they went. With the Norsemen back inside their city walls, the Dál Cash set fire and burned Limerick to the ground. They killed every man of fighting age, and every single woman and child was enslaved. The Norse control in Munster was no more. The Dál Cash were victorious. But even then, Mathgamon's authority was undermined. With the Norsemen defeated and Limerick burned, the rivalry between Onacht and Dál Cash was reawakened. Mathgamon was kidnapped by Donovan, another king of a minor Munster clan, and at the hands of Mael Ruad, his rival turned ally turned rival again, Mathgamon, eldest brother of Brian and king of Munster, was killed. Mael Ruad would then take back the kingship of Munster, but he would not hold it for long, for after Mathgamon's death, Brian, the youngest of 12, became king of Thomond and leader of the Dál Cash. The Battle of Sulcott and the sack of Limerick had made the Dál Cash more rich and powerful than they had ever been before. Brian was just as formidable a military leader as his father and brother had been, and would learn from his brother's shortcomings. Brian's claim to the kingship of Munster would be in no doubt. He began tying up each and every loose end. First, he pursued Ivar of Limerick, much weakened after the loss of his city, and beheaded the Norse king. Then Brian met Mael Ruad of the Onacht at the Battle of Bellachlachta, and with Mael Ruad's death permanently put an end to the Onacht claim for Munster. Finally, Brian rounded up the stragglers. Donovan, who had kidnapped Brian's brother and led to his death, had joined forces with the remaining Vikings of Munster, led by the youngest and last surviving son of Ivar of Limerick, Harold. At the Battle of Cahercubban, Brian killed both Donovan and Harold and was finally the legitimate and only rightful king of Munster. With Munster secure, Brian then set his eyes on something neither his father nor brother could even have dreamed of. Brian pursued the title of High King of Ireland. This is when he would gain another title, gained from the cattle tributes he would pursue. He would be known as Brian Boruma, Brian of the cattle tributes, or Brian Boru. To be continued. Folks, as you all know, Fireside is a proud son of the Headstuff Podcast Network, which is Ireland's largest network of independent podcasts and a loving home for the creative and indeed the curious. There are so many other podcasts I could recommend to you on the network, some of which inspired me to approach Headstuff myself. Here's a taste of one you might enjoy.
My name is Stephanie Preisner and my podcast is called Basically with Stephanie Preisner, and I have guests on every week who explain things to me because they're experts and I'm not. We've had people like Pascal Donoghue, the Minister for Finance, explain what it's like to be the Minister for Finance. We've had on Taoiseach, Micheál Martin explain what it's like to be Taoiseach. Luke O'Neill explaining coronavirus, a nurse explaining what it's like to get coronavirus, and then loads of things that aren't related to coronavirus at all, like politics and being a child actor. If you like finding out about things, listen to Basically with Stephanie Preisner.
And there we have the first part, Brian Boru, Ireland's warrior king, on Fireside, and I hope you enjoyed it. Yes, this will be the first of 3 episodes about Brian Boru. It was originally going to be 2, but they very easily became 3, and I was very happy with them. This is very much the origin story, of course. Brian only becomes King of Munster at the end of this story, and he's not even High King of Ireland yet, but that will all come. But I just thought this was probably the aspect of him that I knew the very least about as to where he came from. And when I discovered all of this, these Tua de Danann roots and these Firbolg roots, and the idea that he had Nuda Lámhairgead's arm on the Dalcash banner, like anyone who's been listening to this podcast since day one who will remember, possibly, I don't know, it was a long time ago, folks. It was nearly 2 years ago now. But in the very early episodes of this podcast, when we did the mythological cycle of Irish mythology, go listen to it if you have not already. And we had all of this. We had the Tua de Danann with their landing and Nuda's arm being cut off, and no one who was not perfect could rule Ireland. And so Nuda had to have a metal arm reconstructed so he could reclaim the High Kingship of Ireland. And we had them tracing their descendancy to Anya, who was the mother of Conora Mór, who we did it in the historical cycle. You might remember she locked herself inside a metal building and she burned to death to save her family. Again, I think that's episode like 42. I actually know that because someone was asking me a question about Conor Mór recently enough on Instagram. I don't just have that kind of encyclopedic Rolodex knowledge of what episodes were which. I wish I did. But so yeah, you have this. What's been incredible is that I've said I was slightly apprehensive of delving that bit more outside of my zone here, because this is getting more and more into history, even though it becomes a lot more complicated. Mythology is more of a simplicity because I feel more bound to the texts in mythology than I do when I'm adapting folktales. When I'm adapting folktales, I listen to the story, you get the bones of your story in there and you write your own version. But there are more kind of gospel texts to the mythology, and so you can't just make stuff up as willingly. You kind of feel there are a bit more consequences, even though mythology across all cultures contradicts itself left, right and centre. But I kind of always feel you need a reason to change something if you are going to actively change something. A lot of the times it's just filling in the blanks or trying to streamline, because you get so many names thrown at you that ultimately don't come back up. But with history, of course, it's a lot less, because it's not, it's not storytelling, it's history. But there is still a huge amount of narrative to it. And that's my job here, is kind of trying to streamline it and put some kind of narrative shape on this invasion saga, this invasion cycle that I've been putting together. And what's been incredible is seeing that even though we're now nearly at the year 1000 in history, where the Tuatha Dé Danann and Ireland's pagan and traditional roots still come back up more and more, even though Ireland has been Christian since the 5th century. So I consider that really, really encouraging and making it seem all the more valid that I am still adapting the history here, or is still adapting these stories, because they are still relevant. This still feels like a continuation of the fireside story and of the sagas. So that is very encouraging. And we have this kingdom. We have this kingdom of the Dál Cash. So Brian, of course, Brian Boru is the first Brian. So all O'Briens trace their name from Brian and his father Kennetig McLorkin, and Kennetig is actually where the name Kennedy is supposed to have had its roots as well. So you have all Kennedys and all Brians. It's kind of thought that all Irish people at some point descended from Brian Boru. Certainly a lot of people would claim. The problem with this period, we get all that we know from Brian Boru, really, from that very controversial text I've spoke about a bit since starting with the Vikings, which is the Wars of the Gael with the Gaul. That's actually what that quote was from at the beginning. This is a quote from a description of the sack of Limerick, which was, "They carried off their jewels and their best property, and their saddles beautiful and foreign, their gold and their silver, their beautifully woven cloth of all colours, and their satins of silken cloth. They carried away their soft, bright, matchless girls, their beautiful silk-clad women, and their active, large, and well-formed boys. The fort and the good town they reduced to a cloud of smoke and to red fire afterwards." So that's from the Wars with the Gaul, which is very much a chronicle of this period. But it was written 100 years later. You know, it was written 100 years later when there was already descendants of Brian who were trying to big him up as much as possible. But I think I was expecting, while reading and researching more about Brian Boru, was that I'd find out that he was significantly less successful or less accomplished than I would have originally thought. But if anything, the exact opposite is true. He did more and more, and it's been really exciting seeing what he did do and what he is rumored to have been truth. Like it's an incredible story, and I can't wait to share more with you about it. And yeah, I was hoping I'd remember to say this. This is going to sound like a really Irish thing, but I can't emphasize this enough. I don't come from a famous Irish family. I don't have a name with a huge amount of lineage. I'm Olahan on my father's side, which I like because that's a very specific Irish name. It's quite rare, so it would usually mean that anyone with the surname Olahan I would be like in some way related to, if not directly related to. And then on my mother's side, it is Curran, which is, again, it's another Irish name, but again, not too rare. But you get here, we had, when we were doing the Battle of Tara, we had that one of the last great Viking kings of Ireland was Olaf Curran, and which is like a Norse version of Curran, and you wonder, like, would we be descended from them? Is that a Norse connection there? But I discovered last week from my family that apparently the Currans were bards at the court of Brian Boru. My grandfather was a great Cork man, great Cork actor named Chris Curran, and he was a Shanachine storyteller himself. He was very much big influence on me still to this day. He died when I was quite young. I only have very, very early memories of him. But supposedly he used to talk about how the Currans were bards at the court of Brian Boru, which sounds like such a thing that everyone's grandfather would say. So it's something that I really want to do more research on. And I did look up something about the Curran name and discovered that there was a very famous bard family which were the Currans of Leitrim. And now Leitrim is a significant bit away from Cork, but it might not. But it was less far away from Clare, and then also you're never going to be too far away from anywhere in Ireland. It's a very, very small island. But so that, seeing that there was definitely a bardic family and that the Currans were known as a bardic family, led some, credibility to my granddad's claim, and it's something I will get a bit more about. But yeah, I know that's the thing that all Irish people and all people with Irish ancestry usually claim some association with Brian Boru or Michael Collins or De Valera or something. Well, maybe less so De Valera the more time goes on. But yeah, I'm not one of those people usually, but if this is true, that would be incredible, because this is what I do now. This is literally what I'm doing now. I'm talking about Brian Boru, and they would have been talking about him at the time 1,000 years ago. So if that is true, and I hope it is, and I'm going to go about like it is, what an incredibly serendipitous fact or thing to have in my mind. Just always makes it feel more like the right thing again, because that's what I love about the podcast medium in general, is it lends itself to the oral tradition so well. I said it right from the beginning. I find it so encouraging that when we're considered that our memories are getting shorter, our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter, that it's I'm going to sound like such an old guy now, that it's TikTok and it's really short videos. That's still one of the most popular mediums of entertainment at the moment, is long form audio, which makes me think that there is still that oral tradition and still that craving for it here today. So, before I go into any more tangents, I'm going to wrap things up there. But I hope you enjoyed that, the first part, Brian Boru, Ireland's Warrior King. It's really, really exciting territory that we're in. And I hope that was, because that was a lot. There was a lot thrown at you, a lot of information. There was a lot of information to sift through. But we have the main players. We just have, it was important to gain that the Dalcash were our significant family, but by no means given anything. Like, Brian gained pretty much everything by the sword, and we'll start to see it gets a lot more Song of Ice and Fiery after this, once it starts getting much more political. But so far, it's just drawn blood. Supposedly Brian Boru loved the axe as well. He took the battle axe from the Vikings and used it very much to his advantage. But it's better from this as we move through his rise to the high kingship of Ireland, and indeed then ultimately to the Battle of Clontarf, the very controversial Battle of Clontarf. It is said that Brian Boru defeated the Vikings, but as we will learn, it is much more complex than that. But lots of fun as well. So please do get in touch. Let me know what you're thinking about this whole thing, about this new invasion saga, this uncharted waters that we're in. I'll wrap up by saying a big thank you to Paddy Allen and Connor here at Head Stuff. It's always still great to be back in the studio. Thank you to Jamie, my producer. Thank you each and every one of you for listening. Please do follow me on Instagram at FiresideBard. Email me at thefiresidebard@gmail.com. Tell someone about the podcast. Support the Patreon, patreon.com/Fireside Podcasts. A big thank you again to the 3 new patrons for this week: Jeff, Matthew and Andrew. I will see you all. You will hear me all next time when we have another folk tale called The Secret Token. Until then, remember, wherever you are and wherever you go, you can always join me by the fireside.
This podcast is part of the Head Stuff Podcast Network.